We've got the shots in view here to show the size of these raised beds. They're approximately 1 metre by 2.4 metres, so that in old money is about 3 foot by 8 foot. There are 16 beds arranged in 4 lots of 4 because I do a 4-year rotation, so I move everything around in 4 years. The main reason I'm showing you this is because you can then work out roughly the area of the total main vegetable garden. We have other vegetables in another garden, but this is the main vegetable garden, which is used intensively. And because we're getting much drier springs at the moment, we need to have enough water to keep this garden well watered in the spring. One of the main reasons why you need to have it well watered in the spring is so that if you get a dry spell, you need to water regularly to get those young plants going. When they're older, they'll be perfectly all right to water them either once a week or possibly at the most twice a week in hot weather. But when they're very young, it's important that they get a good supply of water. Dry springs, and we're going to show you the size of the tanks that we've now got where I can water this bed with a hose pipe from rainwater, which we store in the tanks we're about to show you. We're here by the main storage tanks for this lower garden. As you can see, I'm in a slightly raised position. We're about 1.5 metres above the level of the garden where this water feeds to. And these tanks are 4,000 litre tanks, but I put an overflow at 3,000 litres because we're on fairly soft ground. The benefit of that is that you don't need any special concrete foundations underneath the tanks by reducing the volume within them. Also, they're underneath the solar panels, and therefore it keeps most of the sun off them, and being plastic, the main thing that will degrade plastic is sunlight, so it makes sense to shade them in some way. There are 3 of these tanks down here, so we have 9,000 litres of water which will feed this main vegetable garden that you've just been looking at. Obviously we've got several small ordinary sized tanks about as well, but with the very dry springs that we've been having and any long dry spells, those ordinary water barrels are not enough for the scale of operations that we have. This 9,000 litre capacity storage that we've got here is quite sufficient for the job. These 3 tanks that you can see, we're on the other side now from where we were before. As you can see, the overflow is about 3/4 of the way up the tank. As I said to you, it's a 4,000 litre tank, each one of them. So it has a capacity of 3,000 litres, losing the top small section. Each one has a separate valve on it so that I can turn them off if there's a problem with any of them. And each of these are fed all together, joined all together, and they're fed off the roof of an outbuilding. This little device, which I rigged up myself, has got a float on the other side of it, and that tells me when it's right up there that the tank is completely full. These are quite enough water to deal with the main garden that we were looking at in a very long dry spell. Even up to 10 weeks I could still have a supply of water from here. Spending quite a bit of time outdoors, sometimes with filthy dirty boots, dirty hands, various other things, it's quite useful to have a toilet without having to go indoors. and I'm not a great one for sitting behind a tree, so I built this little unit, which is a composting toilet. It's what's called a dry composting toilet, and basically all it does is separate the urine from the feces. Now, feces really is mostly dead bacteria and any surplus fibre and so on in your diet. The valuable part of it, what comes out of your body, is in fact the urine. And the main reason for that is urine is very high in nitrogen. Proteins are based on nitrogen. Carbohydrates are obviously based on carbon. But any surplus that you have of protein in your diet will be excreted by your kidneys, which will then become part of your pee. That is high in nitrogen and is therefore a particularly good fertiliser. Whether it's used on its own, diluted by probably 10 or 20 to 1, or whether it's used together with other fertilisers, it is still a useful thing to try and preserve. So quite often during the day, to save me going in and being told off by her indoors for muddy boots going into the loo, I use the outdoor toilet here. Perfectly satisfactory system. It separates urine from the feces. The urine goes into a separate bucket, and therefore it can be easily used as an individual fertiliser. The feces, on the other hand, needs to be treated quite separately. The reason for that is it will be relatively high in unpleasant bacteria. Therefore, when emptying this system, which has compostable containers at the bottom, not the bottom of the container, the compost from that needs to be put into a place completely separate from ordinary compost. You should not mix it in with ordinary compost because of the high bacterial content of it. It's important therefore to separate those two, and this toilet does exactly that. Nitrogen from the excess proteins is a good thing, but of course it's also important not to have too much protein in the diet, and the vast number of people who are very concerned about being short of protein actually have far more than they need. So cut down on your proteins. If you're getting enough carbohydrates, basically you are getting enough protein, because the two things come together. Now, the toilet itself has a separating panel inside it which goes down like that. The big problem for us chaps is that we pee in a different direction. Because we tend to stand just for peeing, this toilet can't cope with that, so gents have to sit to have a pee, so that the urine goes against the panel at the front and is separated away. Because this is a dry toilet system, we use sawdust and those containers which you can see in the corner contain sawdust. If you do a poo, you cover the poo with sawdust. That's why it's called a dry system rather than a wet system. There are other types of system about where a fan is used to evaporate off any liquids which gets in there. This does not require a fan, and therefore it requires no electricity, it requires no plumbing. Everything works perfectly well. The urine, because of the separating panel, goes down in underneath, goes to the front part of the unit that you can see there, and then down into the bucket at the bottom. That is treated completely separately from the poo which goes to the back of the unit and is then covered with the sawdust. It's a very good way of using sawdust from my woodshed, which is the building next door.